A maid warned a millionaire not to travel with his fiancée. The next morning, she was visited by someone in a luxury car, and what happened next was an unbelievable surprise. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Elena pressed the damp cloth against the ornate glass vase, her mind drifting to the list of rooms she still had to clean before the end of her shift. The suite she was working on belonged to one of the regulars, Alex Monroe, the tech mogul who seemed to live in a different reality from the rest of them. Elena never saw him much, he was always in and out, accompanied by a team of assistants or his fiancée, Naomi. Still, his rooms were always spotless, luxury oozing from every surface, yet never quite touched by human hands. As she straightened a pillow on the chaise lounge, voices from the adjoining room cut through her thoughts. She paused, recognizing the cool, measured tone of Naomi. It wasn't strange to hear guests talking, she'd overheard countless conversations in her time working at the hotel. Usually nothing more than mundane details, business calls, or petty arguments. But this was different. "I've set everything up, Victor," Naomi said. Her voice, usually sweet and polite, now had an edge that sent a ripple of unease down Elena's spine. "The trip to Geneva is perfect. He won't see it coming." Elena froze, cloth still in hand. She stepped a little closer to the door, feeling guilty but unable to stop herself from listening. She recognized the name Victor, Alex's business partner, or so she'd thought. His voice was low, cold. "Are you sure? No loose ends this time. We can't afford mistakes." "No mistakes," Naomi replied, her voice steely. "By the time anyone figures it out, it'll be too late. Alex will be out of the picture for good." Elena's heart raced, a sudden pressure building in her chest. She gripped the rag tighter, her fingers trembling as the weight of the conversation sank in. They weren't just talking business. They were plotting to kill him. She had to be wrong. This couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. Naomi, the glamorous woman who smiled for the cameras and posed on Alex's arm, was calmly discussing his murder with a man she was supposed to trust. Elena's stomach churned, her thoughts spinning in 100 directions. Should she walk away, pretend she hadn't heard anything? It wasn't her place, after all. She was just the maid. People like Naomi didn't even see her, she was invisible, like the polish on the crystal or the soap in the bathroom. But if she walked away, and something happened, could she live with that? Her feet moved before her mind had caught up. She finished her task as quickly as she could, heart hammering in her chest, then slipped out of the suite, leaving everything tidy behind her like always. But this time, she wasn't just walking out of another room. Elena waited in the lobby, her nerves jangling as she saw Alex Monroe step through the glass doors. He was tall, dressed in his usual sharp suit, his presence commanding without being loud. A group of people trailed behind him, talking into phones or typing on tablets, lost in their own worlds. Alex moved with purpose, too busy to notice the maid standing to the side, clutching her cleaning supplies like a lifeline. She took a deep breath, her throat dry. What was she thinking? Approaching a man like Alex Monroe with something like this? He would laugh in her face. Or worse, ignore her completely. But she didn't have a choice. Not after what she had heard. As Alex walked past her, she found her voice, surprising even herself. "Mr. Monroe?" Her voice cracked slightly, but it was enough to stop him. He turned, his brow furrowed as he looked at her, clearly trying to place her. His eyes flicked to her name tag. "Elena, right?" She nodded, her hands clammy, her heart thudding in her chest. "I need to tell you something. It's important." His gaze narrowed, skepticism already creeping into his expression. "I'm in a hurry. Can this wait?" "No," Elena said, her voice firm despite her nerves. "It's about your trip. The one to Geneva. You shouldn't go." Alex's frown deepened. He glanced at his watch, then at the assistants gathered behind him. Why would I cancel a trip based on a random warning from someone I've never met? She swallowed, unsure how much to say. How could she tell him his fiancé was plotting to kill him without sounding like she'd lost her mind? I overheard something, she said quietly. In your suite. Naomi and Victor, they're planning something bad, something dangerous. Please, just trust me. Don't go. For a moment, Alex didn't say anything. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, the tension between them thick. Elena's heart sank. He wasn't going to believe her. Why would he? She was just the maid. Invisible, like always. But then, Alex sighed. His hand lifted to rub his temple, and he glanced around, as if considering the possibility. I'll think about it, he said finally, his voice clipped. He turned back to his entourage without another word, walking away from her like the conversation had never happened. Elena watched him go, her pulse still racing. Had she done enough? Would he cancel the trip? Or had she just made a fool of herself? Only time would tell. That night, Elena tossed and turned in her small bed, the memory of the conversation replaying over and over in her mind. She kept picturing Alex's face, the slight frown of confusion when she'd spoken to him. Had she sounded crazy? Had he written her off as paranoid? She couldn't stop thinking about it. Every detail of Naomi's cold voice haunted her, every flicker of doubt gnawed at her mind. But the next morning, she found herself standing in the same lobby. And there was Alex, with no entourage this time, no businesslike stride. He was standing by the front desk, speaking quietly to one of the hotel staff. His eyes met hers briefly, but he didn't smile, didn't acknowledge her beyond that one glance. Then, he turned and walked out of the hotel. Elena wasn't sure, but she had a feeling. Something had changed. Something in that conversation had stuck. Alex Monroe had cancelled his trip to Geneva. The next morning, Elena stood in her tiny kitchen, absently stirring sugar into her coffee as the early light filtered through the dingy curtains. Her mind was still running in circles over the events of the past day. She couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in her chest. Even though Alex Monroe had left the hotel without much reaction, something told her he'd listened. But would it be enough? She was about to take a sip of her coffee when the sound of a car engine hummed outside her window, unusually close. Elena frowned, stepping to the window and pushing the curtain aside. Her breath caught. A sleek, black car had pulled up right outside her house. It gleamed against the backdrop of her modest neighborhood, the polished surface almost too shiny for the cracked sidewalks and weathered buildings. No one she knew drove a car like that, not here. Her stomach twisted as a man in a sharp suit stepped out of the driver's side, holding a slim, white envelope in his hand. He glanced up at her window, catching her eye before offering a polite nod and heading toward her door. Elena's pulse quickened. She wiped her hands on her apron, not sure why she felt so nervous. This wasn't her world, after all. Luxury cars, men in suits, none of it made sense to her, not here, in her cramped little corner of the city. A knock sounded at her door. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it slowly, half expecting something surreal to be standing on her doorstep. The man smiled politely, holding out the envelope. "Ms. Elena?" he asked. She nodded, wary but curious. "This is from Mr. Monroe," he said, handing her the envelope with the precision of someone used to delivering far more important things. "He wanted to express his gratitude for your assistance." Her brow furrowed as she took the envelope. Before she could say anything, the man tipped his head, turned, and walked back to the car without another word. She stood there, still as stone, watching as the car slid smoothly down the street and out of sight. Elena looked down at the envelope in her hands, her heart thudding in her chest. She carefully peeled it open, her breath catching at what lay inside. Keys. Two shiny, metallic keys attached to a fob with an address engraved on it, an address she knew, though only in passing. It was one of the most upscale apartment buildings in the city, a place she'd never dreamed she would even step foot in, let alone live. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the crisp card tucked beneath the keys. The note was brief, written in a clean, elegant hand. "Thank you for your warning. I've cancelled the trip. This is for you. A fresh start, no strings attached. Alex Monroe." Elena stared at the note, her mind reeling. A fresh start? An apartment? No strings? The weight of what was being offered suddenly hit her, and for a long moment, she didn't know how to react. It was too much, too far from the life she'd known. People like Alex didn't give gifts like this to people like her. And yet, here she was, holding the proof of it in her hands. That afternoon, Elena found herself standing in front of the towering building, her fingers still curled tightly around the key fob. She had walked by this place before, when running errands or taking a bus into the nicer part of town, but she had never imagined herself going inside. Now, the door was in front of her, heavy and gleaming, reflecting the afternoon sun like a mirror. A man in uniform stood nearby, holding it open for her with a polite smile as if she belonged there, as if this wasn't completely absurd. With a deep breath, she stepped inside. The lobby was even more opulent than she had imagined, polished marble floors, high ceilings with chandeliers that sparkled in the light, soft leather seating arranged in elegant corners. It felt like stepping into another world. A world where she didn't belong. She had never been one for extravagance. Her life had been simple: work hard, pay the bills, and hope that one day things might get a little easier. But now? Now she had the keys to an apartment in a place like this. A friendly concierge greeted her, showing her to the elevator that would take her to her new home. Elena felt numb as she stepped inside the gleaming elevator and watched the floors tick up. It didn't feel real. When she reached the door marked with her number, she hesitated for just a moment before slipping the key into the lock. The door swung open easily, revealing an apartment that could have been pulled straight from a magazine. Modern, sleek, with a view of the city that stretched out beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows. The furniture was pristine, the kind of luxury she'd only ever seen while cleaning other people's homes. Elena moved slowly through the apartment, her fingers grazing over the marble countertops, the plush fabric of the sofa, the smooth finish of the kitchen's high-end appliances. It was surreal, as if she'd stepped into someone else's life. And in a way, she had. But what was she supposed to do now? Despite the apartment and the sudden shift in her circumstances, Elena didn't quit her job. She couldn't. Her life had been built on routine, on hard work, and there was something comforting about slipping back into the rhythm of cleaning rooms, even if it was for people like Alex Monroe. She returned to the hotel the following day, her uniform freshly pressed, her supplies in hand. It felt grounding, familiar. Even as her thoughts kept wandering back to the gleaming apartment waiting for her, she needed this. Needed the routine, the normalcy. But there was a change. People noticed her more, or at least she thought they did. Perhaps it was all in her head, the weight of the new life she had been given pressing down on her. Maybe it was the way the other staff looked at her, curious about why she seemed distracted, why she didn't have the same quiet smile she always wore. Elena wasn't sure how to fit the pieces together yet. How could she reconcile her old life, her simple routines, with this new, overwhelming gift that had been thrust upon her? She didn't belong in that apartment, but here she was, the owner of a luxury home that most people could only dream of. She kept working. She kept cleaning. And in the back of her mind, she kept waiting for something to happen, for the next shoe to drop. For something to remind her that this wasn't really her life at all. The knock at her door came late in the evening, just as Elena was settling into her new apartment, still marveling at the strangeness of her surroundings. The unfamiliar echo of the knock in her spacious, quiet living room sent a shiver down her spine. She wasn't expecting anyone. Elena hesitated for a moment before crossing the polished floor. She peered through the peephole, her stomach tightening when she saw a man standing there, tall and serious-looking, wearing a dark jacket. She debated not answering, but something told her this wasn't the kind of man who would just leave. She opened the door cautiously, her hand gripping the knob a little too tightly. Can I help you? The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. He pulled a badge from his jacket and held it up. Detective Miguel Alvarez. May I come in? Her heart skipped a beat, but she stepped aside, allowing him into the apartment. He took a slow look around, his eyes scanning the luxurious space with a practiced gaze that seemed to catalog every detail. Elena swallowed hard. What's this about? Detective Alvarez turned to face her, his expression unreadable. This is quite the apartment you've got here, Ms. Elena. Impressive place for someone working as a maid at a hotel. The implication was clear, and it hit her like a punch to the gut. I didn't, she started, but he held up a hand. I'm not accusing you of anything, yet. But I've been looking into the recent events surrounding Alex Monroe, his fiancée Naomi, and a man named Victor. It seems things have gotten messy lately. He paused, letting the silence stretch out uncomfortably. Then, out of nowhere, Alex cancels a high-profile trip, and shortly after, a hotel maid moves into a luxury apartment. That's not normal, is it? Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She'd feared this might happen, that the sudden gift from Alex would draw attention, suspicion she hadn't earned. She had never wanted this. But now it was here, in her living room, staring her down with sharp, relentless eyes. I swear, I didn't do anything wrong, she said, her voice cracking slightly. Alex gave me this apartment as a thank you for warning him about Naomi. I overheard her and Victor plotting something about hurting him, and I told him. That's all. Detective Alvarez tilted his head, clearly not convinced. He moved toward the large windows, gazing out at the skyline as if considering her words. Why you? He asked after a long moment. Why would a man like Alex Monroe give you, a maid, an apartment like this just for a warning? Doesn't that seem a bit excessive? Elena bristled, but she couldn't blame him. It was excessive. She knew that. But how could she explain the circumstances without sounding defensive or desperate? I don't know why, she admitted, stepping closer but keeping her distance. Maybe he felt grateful, or maybe he felt guilty. I don't know, but I didn't ask for this. I didn't do anything wrong. Alvarez turned to face her, folding his arms across his chest. There's one way to prove that, you know. Help me. Her breath caught in her throat. Help you? We've been keeping an eye on Naomi and Victor for a while now, he said, his tone steady, calm. They're involved in more than just plotting against Alex. There's something bigger at play here, and we need information. Since you're already close to the situation, I want you to keep an eye on them. Report back to me if you see or hear anything suspicious. Elena stared at him, her mind racing. This was exactly what she had feared, being dragged deeper into a situation she hadn't asked for, didn't want. But what choice did she have? If she said no, she'd still be under suspicion, and that might lead to worse things. If she said yes, she'd be stuck playing a role she didn't know how to handle. Is that really the only way? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alvarez didn't hesitate. Yes. Unless you've got a better idea on how to clear your name. Silence fell between them again, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She looked around the apartment, this place that felt like both a gift and a curse. She had wanted nothing more than to return to her normal life, to keep her head down and go back to work. But normal wasn't an option anymore. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders sagging. Fine. I'll help you. But I'm not a detective, I don't know how. You don't need to be a detective, he cut in, his voice softening just a fraction. Just keep your ears open, keep your eyes sharp, and tell me if anything seems off. That's all I need from you. I'll take care of the rest. Elena swallowed hard, the reality of what she'd just agreed to sinking in. She wasn't cut out for this. She was a maid, used to cleaning up other people's messes, not getting involved in them. But what other choice did she have? Okay, she said finally, her voice barely steady. I'll do it. Detective Alvarez nodded, his eyes flicking to the apartment one last time. Good. I'll be in touch. And, Ms. Elena? She looked up at him, her stomach still churning. Yes. If anything happens, anything at all, you call me. Immediately. He handed her a card with his number on it, then turned and left the apartment, the door closing with a quiet click behind him. Elena stood there for a long time, staring down at the card in her hand. The weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders, and for a moment, she felt like the floor might give way beneath her. She was in over her head. Way over her head. And now, there was no way out. Elena sat at the kitchen table in her new apartment, staring at the card Detective Alvarez had left behind. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, and she found herself wishing it could drown out her thoughts. She'd been at this table for over an hour, her fingers tracing the edges of the card, her mind spinning. She had no idea how she had gotten here, how she'd gone from a quiet life of cleaning hotel rooms to living in a luxury apartment with a detective asking her to spy on a woman she barely knew. But she understood one thing with perfect clarity: she didn't have a choice. If she refused, Detective Alvarez wouldn't stop looking into her, and she couldn't afford to be dragged into something bigger than herself. Not when all she'd done was try to help. So she had to do this. She had to help the detective. With a heavy sigh, she stood, slipping the card into her pocket and pushing aside the anxiety curling in her stomach. She had work in the morning, and now she had to look at that work with fresh eyes. The hotel was bustling when she arrived the next day. Business travelers streamed through the lobby, their luggage rolling behind them, while the front desk staff greeted them with practiced smiles. It felt almost normal, almost like her old routine, except for the heavy weight of her new reality pressing down on her shoulders. Elena made her way to the staff quarters, slipping into her uniform. She glanced around at her coworkers, wondering if any of them could tell something had changed. They were chatting, getting ready for their own shifts, oblivious to the new role she'd been thrust into. For them, it was just another day of cleaning rooms and folding linens. For her, it was something else entirely. She took a deep breath and focused. She was good at her job, at being invisible, and that was exactly what she needed to be now, just a maid, going about her duties, unnoticed by the world around her. No one had to know what she was really doing. Her first stop of the day was Naomi and Victor's suite. Elena paused outside their door, her hand hovering over the handle for a second longer than usual. Her stomach twisted with nerves. She had cleaned this room before, many times. She'd straightened Naomi's silk robes, vacuumed the expensive rugs, wiped down the pristine countertops. But this time, she wasn't just cleaning. She was watching. She pushed the door open and slipped inside. The room was empty, just as she expected. Naomi and Victor weren't here, but their presence lingered in the traces of perfume, the half-filled glass of water on the nightstand, the laptop sitting closed on the desk. Everything in the room was as it always was, luxurious, spotless, and carefully curated. But now, Elena's eyes moved differently. She noticed the small details that she'd always passed over before: the laptop still plugged in, the jacket draped over a chair that hadn't been there the last time she cleaned. She took mental notes as she worked, cataloging everything, even if it seemed insignificant. She had no idea what kind of information Alvarez wanted, but she was going to give him everything she could. As she wiped down the surfaces, she paused by the desk. The laptop was still closed, but next to it was an open folder. She glanced at the papers, just for a second, just long enough to catch a glimpse of names she didn't recognize and the faint outline of what looked like a bank logo. Her pulse quickened. This was what Alvarez had hinted at, something bigger. Something that went beyond just Alex. She couldn't make sense of the details, but she didn't have to. Her job wasn't to confront them, to ask questions, or to dig deeper. Her job was to observe. Elena finished the suite as quickly as she could, her nerves still buzzing as she made her way out of the room and down the hallway. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she knew it was Alvarez, checking in. She ignored it for now. She needed time to breathe, to gather her thoughts. She'd contact him later, after her shift. By the time Elena made it home that evening, exhaustion had set in. Not the kind of physical tiredness that came from a long day of work, but the mental exhaustion that came from keeping her mind constantly alert, always watching, always processing. She tossed her bag onto the couch and sank down beside it, finally letting herself relax for the first time all day. But before she could unwind completely, she pulled out her phone and saw the missed call from Detective Alvarez. With a deep breath, she called him back. Alvarez, he answered on the second ring, his voice as calm and steady as always. "It's Elena," she said quietly, glancing around her empty apartment as if someone might be listening. "I saw something today. Papers, documents, something about a bank. I didn't get a good look, but it seemed important." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough to make Elena wonder if she'd said the wrong thing. "Good," Alvarez said finally. "That's exactly the kind of thing I need. Keep watching. If they leave anything out in the open like that again, make a note of it." Elena nodded, though he couldn't see her. "I will. But I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. What if they catch on?" "They won't," Alvarez said, his voice firm. "You're just a maid, right? That's what they think. Keep it that way, and they won't notice a thing." Elena swallowed hard, her nerves still humming. "Okay. I'll keep you posted." "Stay safe, Elena," Alvarez added, his tone softening just slightly. "You're doing fine." She hung up and let the phone fall onto the couch beside her. The pressure was starting to get to her, the constant weight of pretending everything was normal while her every move felt like part of a game she didn't understand. But she had agreed to this. She had promised to help. And as long as Naomi and Victor were still plotting, she wasn't safe. Tomorrow, she would go back to the hotel, and she would keep watching. For now, though, all she could do was sit in the quiet of her apartment and hope she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. Elena had never thought much about her job as a maid. It was routine, simple, predictable. Dust, clean, organize. Repeat. But now, with her eyes sharpened by the weight of Detective Alvarez's request, she began to realize just how much she had always seen without really seeing. The quiet moments in hotel suites, the lingering presence of wealthy guests, their habits, their little quirks, they'd all become part of the background. But now, they were her clues. Days passed, and Elena fell into a new rhythm. Cleaning was no longer just cleaning. Every time she entered Naomi and Victor's suite, her senses were heightened. She noticed the way Naomi left her perfume bottle slightly askew on the vanity, the stack of papers on the desk that never seemed to disappear, the jackets Victor always threw over the armchair but never wore. Small things, insignificant on their own, but together they painted a picture. A pattern. It didn't take long before Elena started seeing more. Naomi and Victor didn't always stay in the hotel together, and on those days when Victor was absent, strange men would come and go from the suite. Business associates, maybe, but they never stayed long, and they were always careful, leaving no trace behind. No phones, no laptops. Just whispered conversations that Elena couldn't quite catch through the door. Victor, though, was less discreet. He had a habit of pacing, of muttering under his breath when Naomi wasn't around, as if the walls themselves would absorb his frustrations. It was during one of those moments that Elena caught her first real piece of information. It had been a quiet morning. Naomi was out, shopping or at some spa across town. Elena had entered the suite as usual, expecting to find it empty. But Victor was there, pacing the length of the living room, his phone pressed tight against his ear. His voice was low, harsh, and she heard just enough as she stood in the adjoining room, pretending to clean the bathroom. "They're watching me," Victor growled, his tone agitated. "I don't care what she says. I'm not going down for this." Elena's heart raced as she froze, not daring to make a sound. She could hear him moving closer, his heavy footsteps nearing the bathroom door, and she busied herself with scrubbing the sink, keeping her head down. She wasn't here to confront him. She was just a maid. Handle it, Victor hissed into the phone before hanging up. He stormed out of the room without even noticing her, slamming the door behind him. Elena's hands trembled as she finished her cleaning, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She didn't need to understand the full context to know something was wrong. Someone was watching him, or maybe Naomi. And whatever they were involved in, Victor was growing desperate. That evening, after her shift, she called Alvarez. "I heard something today," Elena said, her voice steady but quiet. "Victor's worried. He thinks someone's watching him, and he's not happy about it." Alvarez didn't respond immediately, but she could hear him take a deep breath on the other end of the line. "Good," he said finally. "That's the kind of thing we need. Keep listening. He's going to slip up eventually." Elena bit her lip, the weight of his words settling over her. She was no detective. She wasn't trained for this. But somehow, she had found herself in the middle of it, her natural ability to notice the little things now serving a much larger purpose. The following week, Elena's observations became even sharper. She began to notice the way Naomi and Victor operated like two separate entities, each with their own secrets. Naomi kept her movements deliberate, always composed, while Victor grew more erratic by the day. She'd find him staring at papers on the desk, clenching his fists as if trying to figure out what to do next. Naomi, on the other hand, played her role perfectly. Every smile in public, every casual interaction with the hotel staff was polished and precise. Elena didn't let it go unnoticed. She saw the way Naomi smoothed the papers before putting them away, the slight tightening of her jaw when a phone call lasted longer than usual. She was hiding something, and Elena was starting to piece it together. The guests they met with were just as careful. There were no raised voices, no arguments, but the tension was palpable. These were not friends or business partners in the traditional sense. Their meetings were too brief, their smiles too thin. One afternoon, while cleaning the hallway outside their suite, Elena caught sight of one of the visitors leaving. He wore a crisp suit, his expression neutral, but he glanced over his shoulder 3 times before disappearing into the elevator. Elena quickly jotted down the time and the man's description in her phone. She didn't know who he was, but something about him didn't sit right. Later that night, she called Alvarez again. "I saw someone today," she told him, replaying the man's features in her mind. He looked worried. Kept glancing around like he didn't want anyone to see him. Alvarez hummed thoughtfully on the other end of the line. "Did you get a good look at him?" "Yeah," Elena replied. "Tall, brown hair, mid-40s. He was wearing a dark suit, expensive. He didn't stay long." "I'll look into it," Alvarez said. "You're doing good, Elena." "Better than good, actually." She blinked in surprise. "Really?" "Yeah," he said, his voice softening just a little. "You've got a good eye. Most people would miss the things you're picking up. It's not easy, keeping track of details like this. But you've got a knack for it." Elena's heart swelled at his words. She hadn't realized just how closely she'd been paying attention, how her years of unnoticed work had made her sharp, almost invisible in the background while still catching every small movement, every shift in routine. "Thanks," she said quietly, not sure what else to say. She hadn't expected praise. Not for this. She'd just been trying to stay out of trouble, to keep her head down like always. But something had changed in her. She wasn't just doing this to protect herself anymore. She was doing it because she wanted to get to the bottom of whatever Naomi and Victor were hiding. And maybe, just maybe, she was good at it. "You're not just helping me, Elena," Alvarez continued. "You're helping bring something bigger to light. Don't forget that." She nodded, though he couldn't see her. "I won't." The pieces started falling into place slowly, almost too slowly for Elena to realize the scale of what she was uncovering. It wasn't just whispers behind closed doors or secret meetings anymore. What she'd stumbled upon was something far more sinister, a deliberate, calculated plan to strip Alex Monroe of everything he built. Naomi and Victor weren't just after Alex's life. They wanted his empire. Elena had always thought of Naomi as the polished, picture-perfect fiancée, always in control, always composed. But as she observed Naomi's interactions with Victor and the others, it became clear that she was more than just the woman on Alex's arm. She was the mastermind. And Victor? He was a pawn, just like everyone else in her carefully crafted game. The realization came one afternoon, when Elena was going through her routine cleaning in their suite. Naomi had stepped out for a meeting, leaving behind her open laptop on the desk. Normally, Elena would have ignored it. She wasn't trying to pry more than necessary. But something caught her eye. An email, half-written, sat open on the screen. And there it was, right in front of her, a detailed plan outlining how Naomi and Victor were going to divert funds from Alex's company into a series of shell corporations. Elena's stomach twisted as she read the lines. It wasn't just about Alex's life anymore. Naomi and Victor had been siphoning off his assets, slowly but surely, and were setting him up to take the fall. If things went according to their plan, Alex would be ruined. His business, his reputation, his entire future, all of it would collapse, leaving him with nothing. Elena closed the laptop quickly, her hands shaking. This was bigger than she'd ever imagined. This wasn't just about a personal betrayal between lovers, it was a financial hit, a cold-blooded attempt to dismantle Alex's entire world. She didn't wait until the end of her shift to call Detective Alvarez. The moment she was outside the hotel, she dialed his number, barely able to keep her voice steady. "They're stealing from him," she said, barely giving him a chance to answer. "It's not just about hurting Alex, they're taking his money, his business. They're setting him up to look like he's the one doing something illegal." Alvarez was silent for a moment, long enough to make Elena worry she hadn't explained it well enough. "Tell me everything," he said finally, his voice tense. Elena took a deep breath and recounted everything she'd seen, the shell companies, the financial trail Naomi had outlined in the email, and the way Victor was helping her behind the scenes. She could hear Alvarez scribbling down notes as she spoke, the quiet scratch of his pen the only sound on the other end of the line. When she finished, there was another pause. "This is serious," he said, his tone grim. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a case of fraud. They're orchestrating a complete financial collapse. And if they pull it off, Alex will be left with nothing but a pile of legal troubles to deal with." Elena swallowed, her throat dry. "What do we do?" "We need proof," Alvarez said, his voice hardening with resolve. "What you've seen is enough to give us a lead, but we need something solid, something that can tie Naomi and Victor to the siphoning. We need documents, records, anything that can show they're behind this." Elena's heart sank. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't even supposed to be involved in any of this. But now, here she was, standing at the edge of something far too big for her to handle alone. "I'll see what I can do," she said, though the words felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Over the next few days, Elena's life became a blur of tension and constant observation. Every time she stepped into Naomi and Victor's suite, her senses were on high alert. She began to notice more details, more of the little things she might have overlooked before. The way Naomi's laptop was almost always open to financial documents, the meetings Victor had with shadowy figures who never stayed long enough to draw attention, and the whispers about timelines, deadlines, and legal loopholes. The scheme was unfolding before her eyes. Naomi wasn't just a manipulator, she was a strategist. Every move was calculated, every step designed to ensure that when Alex's world came crashing down, she and Victor would walk away untouched, and richer than before. But with every new piece of information Elena gathered, the tension grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time. Alex didn't know what was happening, didn't see the web tightening around him. And Naomi was getting bolder. She wasn't worried about being caught. If anything, she seemed more confident by the day, as if she could already taste victory. Elena had to move faster. She began to take risks, small ones, at first. Staying in the suite just a few minutes longer than usual, lingering by the desk to see if there were any papers left out, quickly scanning the computer screens when Naomi and Victor weren't paying attention. Her pulse raced every time, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to act like she was just doing her job. Just cleaning. One afternoon, as she dusted the edges of the desk, she spotted a USB drive plugged into Naomi's laptop. Her breath caught in her throat. Was this it? Could this be the proof Alvarez needed? Before she could talk herself out of it, Elena grabbed her phone and took a quick photo of the screen. She didn't have time to read the document in detail, but she caught enough: figures, company names, offshore accounts. It was all there, laid out in neat, precise lines. That night, she sent the photo to Alvarez. His response came almost immediately. "This is good," he texted back. "Keep going." But with every step forward, Elena's fear grew. She was in too deep now. Naomi and Victor didn't suspect her, not yet, but it was only a matter of time before they realized someone was onto them. And when that happened, Elena knew they wouldn't just sit back and let it unravel. As she sat in her apartment, staring at the messages from Alvarez, the weight of the situation settled over her. She wasn't just helping a detective anymore. She wasn't just trying to clear her name. She was fighting to stop something that could ruin a man's life. The shift in Naomi's demeanor was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But Elena noticed. She always noticed. The way Naomi would pause, eyes scanning the room as if searching for something, or someone. The brief flashes of irritation that crossed her face when a conversation went longer than expected, or when someone interrupted her train of thought. It was the kind of change only someone like Elena, who had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, could pick up on. Naomi was growing suspicious. Elena could feel the unease settle deep in her bones. Every day she stepped into that suite, her heart raced a little faster, her palms damp with nerves she couldn't shake. She had been careful, so careful, but she knew that the more she uncovered, the greater the risk of being caught. Naomi was no fool. If she figured out that Elena was more than just a maid, things could go very wrong, very fast. But despite the knot of fear tightening in her chest, Elena kept going. She couldn't stop now. Too much was at stake. One afternoon, as Elena wiped down the marble countertops in the suite, she caught a glimpse of Naomi sitting by the window, phone pressed to her ear. The blinds were half closed, casting long shadows across the room, but Naomi's posture was rigid, her voice sharp and controlled. "I don't care what it takes," Naomi hissed, her back to Elena. "We need to move faster. Everything has to be finalized before he figures it out." Elena's pulse quickened. They were speeding up the plan. She slowed her movements, making sure not to draw attention to herself as she cleaned the adjoining room, listening as Naomi's words continued to flow like ice. "If we don't act now, Alex will start digging," Naomi continued. "We can't afford any more delays. Victor's handling the offshore transfers, but we need to push everything through within the next 48 hours. Elena's heart raced. 48 hours. That wasn't much time. They were accelerating their plan, and if Naomi and Victor succeeded, Alex would be blindsided, financially ruined, with no way to stop it. Elena couldn't wait any longer. She finished her cleaning quickly, making sure to avoid eye contact with Naomi, who was still deep in conversation. When she left the room, her hands trembled, but her mind was clear. This was the breakthrough Alvarez needed. That night, Elena met with Detective Alvarez in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was quieter there, away from prying eyes, away from the chaos of the hotel. She slid into the booth across from him, her pulse still racing from what she'd overheard earlier. "They're speeding things up," Elena said without preamble. "Naomi's pushing everything through. She said they'll have everything done within the next 48 hours. Whatever they're planning, it's happening now." Alvarez's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. 48 hours? Elena nodded, trying to steady her breathing. "She's got Victor handling the transfers. Offshore accounts. I didn't get all the details, but it sounds like they're about to finalize the whole thing, taking Alex's money, framing him, everything. The detective rubbed his chin, his mind clearly racing as he processed the information. "This is bigger than we thought," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "We need to act now, before they make their move." Elena's stomach twisted at his words. She knew what that meant. The pressure was mounting, and now it wasn't just about gathering information. It was about stopping them before it was too late. "What do we do?" Elena asked quietly, though the weight of the question hung heavy between them. Alvarez's gaze met hers, the intensity in his eyes unmistakable. "We move fast," he said. "I'll get a warrant. We'll raid the accounts and lock down the transactions before they can finalize anything. But we need to make sure they don't suspect anything before we do. If Naomi and Victor catch wind of this, they'll disappear, and they'll take Alex's money with them." Elena swallowed hard, her nerves fraying at the edges. This was it. This was the turning point. If they didn't act now, everything Naomi and Victor had planned would unfold perfectly, and Alex would be the one left holding the pieces. But the fear remained. If Naomi even suspected that Elena had been feeding information to Alvarez, she wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. Naomi was dangerous, and Elena knew too much now to simply walk away. The next morning, Elena returned to the hotel, her mind racing with what Alvarez had said. She had to act normal, as if nothing had changed. But every time she walked past Naomi in the suite, every time Victor's cold gaze landed on her, the knot in her stomach tightened. She had to keep it together for just a little longer. The pressure mounted as the day wore on. Elena caught glimpses of documents, hurried meetings between Naomi and Victor, and more phone calls that sent tension rippling through the air. But Naomi's suspicions grew too. Elena could feel it in the way Naomi's eyes lingered on her for a second longer than usual, the way her smile seemed sharper, more dangerous. By the afternoon, Elena knew the risk had reached its peak. She could feel the shift in the air, the way Naomi's movements were more calculated, as if she was expecting something to go wrong. "Elena," Naomi said, stopping her just as she was about to leave the room. The sound of her voice made Elena freeze in her tracks. "Yes." Elena turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Naomi smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Have you noticed anything unusual around here lately?" The question was loaded, and Elena knew it. She forced herself to remain calm, her fingers tightening slightly around the cleaning supplies in her hands. "No, ma'am. Everything's been normal." Naomi's gaze lingered on her, sharp and assessing, before she finally nodded. "Good. Just making sure." Elena exhaled slowly once she was out of Naomi's sight, her pulse still racing. She had come too close. Naomi was on edge, and if anything tipped her off now, it would all fall apart. She had to get out of here, and she had to do it fast. That evening, Elena sent one last text to Alvarez, detailing everything she'd seen throughout the day. The meetings, the documents, the hurried phone calls. It was all happening, right in front of her, and now it was only a matter of hours before Naomi and Victor executed their plan. "Get ready," she typed. "They're making their move." Alvarez's response was immediate. "We're on it." The weight of what Elena was about to do pressed heavily on her shoulders as she sat in Detective Alvarez's car that evening, just a few blocks away from the upscale restaurant where Naomi and Victor were having their private dinner. The plan was set, everything was in motion, but the nerves twisting in her stomach made it feel far from certain. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Alvarez asked, his voice calm but with an edge of seriousness she hadn't heard before. He was watching her closely, his dark eyes scanning her face for any sign of doubt. Elena met his gaze, feeling the fear gnawing at the edges of her resolve. She wasn't a cop. She wasn't trained for this. But she had come this far, and backing out now wasn't an option. Too many people were counting on her. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice was quieter than she intended. Alvarez nodded, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the clock on the dashboard. The police were already in position, waiting for her signal. It was simple, really, she just had to give them a sign when the time was right. But that simplicity didn't ease the tension coursing through her. "We have your back, Elena," Alvarez reassured her. "You won't be alone. As soon as you give us the signal, we'll move in. Just make sure you stay calm, no sudden movements. Let us handle Naomi and Victor." Elena nodded, though her pulse quickened with every word. She had spent weeks gathering the evidence, carefully piecing together the threads of Naomi and Victor's scheme. Now, the end was finally within reach. But knowing that Naomi suspected something, knowing the danger she was walking into, it felt like stepping onto thin ice, hoping it wouldn't crack beneath her. Taking a deep breath, she opened the car door and stepped out into the cool evening air. The upscale restaurant sat at the end of the street, its entrance glowing with the soft light of elegant chandeliers and the low murmur of well-dressed patrons milling about. Elena walked toward the building, her heart pounding in her ears. Inside, the restaurant was even more extravagant. A soft buzz of conversation filled the air, waiters in crisp white shirts moved with practiced ease, and the scent of rich food wafted through the dimly lit space. Elena's stomach churned, not from hunger, but from the knowledge that Naomi and Victor were seated in the private room just beyond the main dining area. She approached the maitre d', who gave her a curious look, but didn't ask any questions. With a polite nod, he led her to the door of the private room, the heels of her shoes tapping softly against the polished floor. Every step felt heavy, each one carrying her closer to the point of no return. Naomi and Victor were already seated when she entered, their quiet conversation interrupted by her arrival. Naomi's eyes flicked toward her, a thin smile curving her lips as if she had expected Elena to be there all along. "Elena," Naomi said smoothly, motioning toward the empty seat across from her. "You're right on time. Please, join us." Elena swallowed, forcing herself to remain calm as she took the seat Naomi offered. Her fingers curled into fists beneath the table, hidden from view, as she tried to steady her breathing. Victor barely acknowledged her, his attention focused on the glass of wine in front of him. He looked more agitated than usual, his movements sharper, more restless. Elena didn't know if he had figured out what was coming, but there was an edge to his demeanor tonight that made her even more nervous. "We've been discussing some future plans," Naomi said casually, her eyes gleaming as they met Elena's. "It's an exciting time, wouldn't you agree?" Elena forced a smile, knowing that every word Naomi spoke was laced with double meanings. "It certainly seems that way." The conversation drifted into vague pleasantries, but Elena's mind was elsewhere. She was waiting for the right moment, the moment when the police, led by Alvarez, would storm in and end this nightmare. She had only one job left, to give them the signal. Naomi leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You've been such a help these past few weeks, Elena. I hope you know how much I appreciate it. You've kept things running smoothly." Elena's heart skipped a beat. She knew Naomi was testing her, baiting her, looking for cracks. The suspicion that had been building for days was now practically tangible, hovering in the air between them. Naomi knew something wasn't right, but she hadn't figured it all out yet. Elena gave her the same calm, composed look she had perfected while working in the background, but the tension gnawed at her from the inside. She couldn't afford to slip up now. As Naomi continued to speak, Elena's eyes darted toward the entrance of the private room. The maitre d' hovered nearby, a silent participant in their conversation, but Elena caught the slight movement behind him, the unmistakable presence of Alvarez and his team. It was time. Elena leaned forward slightly, her hand brushing the side of her hair in a casual gesture. It was the agreed-upon signal, subtle but clear enough for the detective to catch. She could feel her pulse racing, her breath coming in shallow waves as she lowered her hand, her eyes locking briefly with Alvarez's before she looked away. Naomi's smile widened, as if she sensed something shifting in the air, but it was too late. The door to the private room swung open, and within seconds, the quiet murmur of the restaurant was replaced by the sharp commands of police officers. "Naomi Anders, Victor King, stay where you are." Alvarez's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He entered the room, flanked by officers who moved swiftly, guns drawn but calm. "You're under arrest." The surprise on Naomi's face was brief, so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. But Elena saw it. It flickered across her features for just a second before she regained her composure, her lips curling into something between a smile and a sneer. Victor, on the other hand, wasn't as controlled. His chair scraped back, a look of sheer panic crossing his face as he started to rise, but the officers were on him in an instant, pinning him back down with firm hands. Naomi stayed seated, her eyes never leaving Elena. "You played your part well," she said softly, her voice low enough that only Elena could hear. "I underestimated you." Elena didn't respond, but the rush of relief that flooded through her veins was almost overwhelming. It was over. After weeks of fear, of playing this dangerous game, it was finally over. The officers cuffed Naomi and Victor, leading them out of the restaurant as the other patrons looked on, whispering in shock. Alvarez stayed behind, his gaze meeting Elena's as he approached her. "You did good," he said quietly, his voice filled with both gratitude and relief. "We got them." Elena nodded, unable to find her voice for a moment. She had done it. She had helped bring down Naomi and Victor before they could destroy Alex's life. And in the process, she had proven something to herself, that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. Elena sat across from Detective Alvarez in the dimly lit precinct office, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The tension of the last few weeks still clung to her like a second skin, but there was a strange sense of relief beginning to take hold. It was over. Naomi and Victor were in custody, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Elena could breathe. Alvarez leaned back in his chair, his face softening in a way she hadn't seen before. He'd always been focused, sharp, the kind of man who didn't let emotions cloud his work. But now, as he regarded her with a mix of respect and appreciation, she could sense the shift. She wasn't just an asset to him anymore, she was a key player, someone he owed a great deal to. "You did more than I could have asked for," Alvarez began, his voice steady but sincere. "Without you, this operation wouldn't have been possible. You were the one who got us the evidence, the one who tipped us off when they were making their move. I'm sure you realize how dangerous it was." Elena managed a small smile, though the weight of everything she'd gone through still clung to her. "I just did what needed to be done." "You did more than that," Alvarez corrected. "You were brave. And, because of that, I'm here to officially clear your name. The department knows you had no involvement in Naomi and Victor's scheme other than helping us take them down." The words were like a weight lifted off her chest. It was the validation she hadn't realized she needed until this moment. All that time fearing that her sudden leap from hotel maid to luxury apartment owner would cast doubt on her, that people would suspect her of being part of something she hadn't asked to be involved in, that fear was gone now. Elena took a deep breath, letting it out slowly as the reality of her freedom settled in. "So, no more investigations? No more suspicion?" Alvarez smiled faintly. "You're in the clear. Completely. And you've got a few friends in the department now, if you ever need anything." The thought of having friends in law enforcement felt surreal, but Elena nodded. "I appreciate that." "You deserve it," Alvarez said. He paused for a moment, his expression growing more serious. "I know you didn't ask for this. But you handled it better than most people would have. You didn't just help us, you helped Alex too. You stopped them from destroying his life." Elena's mind wandered briefly to Alex Monroe, the man at the center of this storm. It still felt strange to think that she had been swept into his world, a world of power, wealth, and betrayal. But she had done what she set out to do. She had protected him, even if he didn't fully realize just how close he had come to losing everything. Speaking of Alex, Alvarez continued, interrupting her thoughts, he reached out. "He wants to talk to you again." Elena's heart skipped a beat. The last time Alex had contacted her, it had been with an offer she couldn't refuse, the luxury apartment she now called home. But things had changed since then. She wasn't the same person who had timidly accepted that gift, unsure of what her life had become. She had proven to herself that she was more capable than she'd ever imagined. The meeting with Alex came 2 days later, in a quiet cafe not far from where it had all begun. Elena arrived early, taking a seat by the window and letting the soft morning light wash over her. She felt different now, stronger, more certain of who she was and what she wanted. When Alex walked in, dressed in his usual polished attire, he seemed a little less imposing than before. There was a weariness to his expression, but also a sense of gratitude. He smiled when he saw her and made his way to the table, sliding into the seat across from her. "Elena," he said warmly, his voice carrying that same charm she'd come to recognize. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to meet with me." Elena returned the smile, though hers was more subdued. "I wasn't sure myself. But I think we needed to have this conversation." Alex nodded, running a hand through his dark hair as he settled in. "I owe you more than I can put into words. You saved me, my life, my business, everything. And I know that what Naomi and Victor were doing could have destroyed me." "I just did what anyone would have done," Elena replied, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. Most people would have walked away, too afraid to get involved. But she hadn't. She couldn't. Alex leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I still want to help you. I know I already gave you the apartment, but I can do more. Whatever you need, money, support, connections, just say the word, and it's yours." Elena's heart swelled with gratitude, but something inside her had changed since this all began. She didn't need more from Alex. She didn't want more. The apartment had been enough of a gift, but now, she was ready to stand on her own 2 feet. "I appreciate the offer, Alex," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "But I don't need anything else from you. You've been generous, and I'm grateful, but I think it's time for me to figure things out on my own." Alex blinked, clearly taken aback by her response. He hadn't expected her to turn him down. "Are you sure?" "I really want to help." "I'm sure," Elena replied firmly. The apartment was more than enough. "I'm happy with where I am now. I've learned a lot through all of this, and I think it's time for me to take the next steps by myself." Alex stared at her for a moment, then slowly nodded, a look of admiration crossing his face. "You're stronger than I realized." Elena smiled, a quiet confidence settling over her. "I had to be." For a few moments, they sat in comfortable silence, the hum of the cafe around them, both of them reflecting on everything that had brought them to this point. Elena could feel the shift in the air, a sense of closure, of things finally coming full circle. As they finished their conversation, Alex stood to leave, offering her a warm smile. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. I'll always be in your corner, Elena." "Thank you, Alex," she said, her voice gentle but resolute. "But I think I'll be just fine." And as Alex walked away, Elena felt a lightness settle over her, a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She had cleared her name, protected the people who needed it, and had proven to herself that she was more than just a maid. She had a future, one she could shape however she wanted. The apartment felt different now. Not because of its size or the luxury that surrounded Elena, but because of the sense of calm that had settled in since everything had come to an end. No more shadowy plots, no more watching her back. The quiet was comforting, but there was something else brewing inside her, something she couldn't ignore anymore. Elena had always thought she knew her place in the world. She was the invisible presence, the one who slipped into rooms unnoticed, cleaned the spaces, and left without leaving a trace. But in the last few months, everything had changed. She had discovered something about herself, something she hadn't expected. She had a talent, a gift for seeing things that others missed, for putting together pieces of a puzzle that others might overlook. It had started as survival. But now, it felt like something more. Detective Alvarez had stopped by the apartment earlier that day, not on official business, but just to check in. They had kept in touch since the arrest of Naomi and Victor, and their conversations had shifted from the case to other things, life, the future. Alvarez had seen the change in her too, and during their last meeting, he'd said something that had stuck with her. "You have a gift, Elena," he had said, sipping his coffee as he leaned back in her kitchen chair. "Most people wouldn't have noticed half of what you picked up on." You have a natural eye for detail. You know how to listen, how to observe without being seen. You could do something with that. She had laughed it off at first, shaking her head. I'm just a maid, Alvarez. I don't know the first thing about real investigations. But Alvarez had just smiled. You're not just anything. You've been investigating this entire time, and you're damn good at it. The words echoed in her mind long after he left. It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, but now, with the dust settling and her life feeling more open than ever, she began to really think about it. Maybe Alvarez was right. Maybe there was something more she could do with this skill, something beyond just getting by. Elena looked around her apartment, a faint smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't the apartment itself that made her happy. It was what the space represented: freedom, possibility, a clean slate. She wasn't tied to the life she had before. She didn't have to return to the hotel or settle for fading back into the background. She had choices now. The idea started small, like a seed planted in her mind that grew slowly over the days that followed. Every time she thought about her future, it sprouted a little more, until she couldn't ignore it any longer. Elena had spent her life observing from the sidelines, unnoticed and quiet. But what if she could use that to help people? Not just people like Alex Monroe, who had wealth and power to protect themselves, but regular people, people who didn't have anyone looking out for them. There was a need for discretion, for someone who could quietly gather information without causing a stir. Elena knew firsthand how much the truth mattered, how finding it could change everything. She had uncovered Naomi and Victor's plot not through force, but by listening, by watching. It wasn't about flashy detective work, it was about patience, persistence, and the ability to blend in. And that, she realized, was her strength. So, one morning, she decided to take the leap. It wasn't easy, nothing about starting something new ever was, but for the first time, she felt like she was moving towards something that truly fit her. She didn't need a big office or expensive equipment. What she needed, she already had: a sharp eye, an ability to listen, and a desire to help. Elena started small. She put the word out quietly, testing the waters with a few people she knew. She told them she was offering discreet investigative services, not for the rich, not for high-stakes corporate cases, but for everyday problems. Suspicious spouses, workplace issues, missing personal items, small, personal cases where her skills could make a real difference. Her first client was a woman named Rosa, who worked as a nanny for a well-to-do family. Rosa had been accused of stealing from the family, and though she swore she was innocent, no one believed her. Elena had met her briefly during her time at the hotel, and when Rosa heard about Elena's new venture, she reached out in desperation. Elena's heart went out to her. This was exactly the kind of case she had imagined when she started down this path: someone who had no one to turn to, who was being overlooked and dismissed. Within days, Elena had quietly gathered the information Rosa needed to clear her name. It turned out the theft had been committed by someone else entirely, a houseguest who had been visiting the family and had taken advantage of their trust. Elena had uncovered the truth with careful observation, using her ability to blend in, to remain unnoticed while listening and watching. When Rosa's name was cleared, the gratitude in her eyes was overwhelming. Elena had made a difference, and it felt better than she could have imagined. It wasn't just about solving a mystery, it was about giving people back their dignity, their peace of mind. As the days turned into weeks, Elena's discreet investigative service began to grow. Word spread quietly, mostly through referrals and word of mouth. She wasn't advertising to the world, that wasn't her style. But the people who needed her found her, and that was enough. Detective Alvarez checked in from time to time, always with a knowing smile on his face. "I knew you'd be good at this," he'd say whenever they met up for coffee. He offered advice when she needed it, but for the most part, he let her find her own way. This was her path now, and she was walking it confidently. One evening, as Elena sat at her small desk, organizing her notes for a new case, she glanced out the window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The same city that had once seemed so daunting, so full of uncertainty, now felt like a place of endless possibility. She had come so far from the woman who quietly cleaned hotel rooms, fading into the background while other people's lives played out around her. Now, she was someone different, someone who could step into the light, who could make a difference for the people who needed it most. Elena smiled to herself as she turned back to her work. This was just the beginning, but it was a good one. She didn't need wealth or power to feel successful. She had her independence, her confidence, and a new sense of purpose. And for the first time in a long time, Elena felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be.